our first video of tissue types, we're going to focus on epithelial tissue, and we'll have a separate video for each one of these. I'll probably put nervous tissue and muscular tissue on one video because they're much shorter. But epithelial and connective tissue, within that, they have lots of different types, so they're going to be longer. So we're going to start with epithelial. Epithelial tissue consists of a flat sheet of very closely adhering cells, and there are only one or more cells thick. Usually the upper apical surface is exposed to the environment or internal space in the body. So this covers all of our body surfaces and also lines all of our body cavities. There's a lot of kinds of tissue. It forms the external and inner linings of many of our organs. It also has lots of glands embedded in these epithelial tissues. And the extracellular material is so thin that we can't see it with the light microscope. So it's just going to look like cell next to cell next to cell. And epithelium doesn't allow room for blood vessels. So all the cells are real packed in there, tight next to each other, and blood vessels do not reach to those cells. And so it is considered avascular. It does lay on a layer of loose connective tissue, which the loose connective tissue is where the blood vessels reach to, and then the substances are going to diffuse from there. One thing that you'll be asked to label in the lab is a basement membrane. It's the layer between the epithelial tissue and then the connective tissue underneath it. It doesn't have any cells. It usually kind of looks like a border. It should be pretty easy to identify. It anchors the epithelium to the connective tissue below it. So when we look at epithelium, they're going to have different names, and the names are based on the layers of cells and the shape of the cells. So a lot of times you'll see epithelium with two words before the type of, or that constitute the type of epithelium. And the first word is usually either simple or stratified. So let's contrast those first. Simple epithelium contains one layer of cells. Now, I don't want you to think that just when you look in the microscope, you're only going to see one layer of cells. But maybe, but it depends again on the section that you're looking at. But if you see one layer of cells that seem to be just one layer thick, that is going to be a type of simple epithelium. They are then going to be named by the shape of their cells. And all cells in simple epithelium touch the basement membrane. So you'll just see one layer of epithelial cells and then the basement membrane below it. Stratified epithelium looks way more complicated. It has more than one layer, so stratified means more than one layer. Again, we're going to name it by the shape of the cells, but some cells rest on top of others, so they don't all touch the basement membrane. Only the bottom layer is going to touch the basement membrane. And then this shows us our cell shapes as well on the bottom. So squamous means flat, cuboidal means like a cube shape, and columnar means kind of like a cylinder or a column. So there's four types of simple epithelium, and they're named for their cell shapes. So we're going to have a slide for each one. Simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, and then pseudostratified. Pseudostratified is a little more complicated. We're going to look at that when we get there. In these four types, you will be able to see goblet cells. Goblet cells look like little wine glasses. They're even with the edge, the outer layer of cells, and they are mucus secreting cells. You should be able to see those on your slides in the lab. So here's simple squamous. Like I said, it doesn't really just look like one layer of cells all by itself. This is showing one layer of epithelial cells, but then right underneath it there's some smooth muscle. So it doesn't look like one little layer by itself, but it is only one layer of epithelial cells, a single row of thin cells. This type of epithelial tissue allows rapid diffusion of substances across that one layer. They also secrete serous fluid. We find these in the alveoli in the lungs, the glomeruli in the kidneys, and in the skin. Okay, our next type of simple epithelium is simple cuboidal, And in the lab here, you're going to see lots of kind of circles or ovals because it's showing around a tube, essentially. That's where we find mostly simple cuboidal epithelium. So it's a single layer of square or roundish looking cells. We find these in areas that are doing absorption or secretion, such as the liver, the thyroid, and mammary and salivary glands, and bronchioles and kidney tubules. So on the microscope, they're going to look like weird open spaces surrounded by a layer of square or round cells. Simple columnar, again, one layer of single cells or single layer of cells, but these are tall, narrow cells. I think they more look like cylinders than columns, but okay. And then usually they'll have a nuclei in the bottom half of the cell or the basal half of the cell. And sometimes you'll see a brush border of microvilli at the other end of the cell. In some organs, not all, you will see goblet cells. So that little white looking blob is a goblet cell, and you can see it's called a wine glass shape because it kind of opens up to the outer membrane of the cell, and that does secrete mucus. Again, these types of cells are specified for absorption and secretion. We see them in our GI tract, in the uterus, kidneys as well. Okay, here's pseudostratified. It's probably my least favorite tissue type of all. Pseudostratified, you know, pseudo means false. Pseudostratified means it looks like it's stratified, but it's really not. It looks like there's more than one layer of nuclei, but there's really not. They all touch the basement membrane, but not all of the cells kind of make it to that free surface. So some of them are abnormally shaped and they're not all in a perfect little lined up little row. They're weird shapes, and so there really is one layer, but the way the nuclei are all kind of smashed together, it looks like there's more than one layer. They do have cilia at that free surface, and they do have goblet cells. They secrete and propel mucus. That's what the cilia is doing. We talked about cilia is moving on the outside of the cell, and we see these in the respiratory tract. Stratified epithelia is any layers 2 to 20 or more layers, but anything more than one layer is considered stratified. The cells are directly relying or resting on other cells, and only the deepest layer is what is attached to the basement membrane. And we have 4 types of stratified epithelium, again named for there's more than one layer of cells, and then for the shape of the cells. Okay, stratified squamous is the most widespread epithelium in the body. The deepest layer is what's going through mitosis constantly and pushing newer cells towards the surface, and then the cells at the surface kind of die and flake off as more new cells come up. We see stratified squamous epithelium in 2 types. Keratinized, which is what we have on the skin surface. It has a protein keratin in it. And then non-keratinized. It doesn't have that protein keratin, and it doesn't have a surface layer of dead cells. Under the microscope, they look very similar. You would probably need a reference as to tell you which is keratinized and which is not, but this is keratinized. We see this on the epidermis. Our skin, our palms and soles are very heavily keratinized. They have a lot of keratin in their cells. It's just a protein. It helps retard water loss or slow down water loss in the skin to hold water inside, and it also is protection. So there's non-keratinized, and again, I find that looking at them, I'm just like, okay, there's lots of layers of flat cells. Great, that's stratified squamous. I would rather you focus on being able to tell if it's stratified squamous based on the cell shape than not too worried about keratinized or not keratinized. Stratified cuboidal is 2 or more layers of square or round cells. We see these in sweat gland ducts, in our fallopian tubes, and our ovaries, and in the seminiferous tubules in men. This is hard to find. Those of you in the lab that are struggling to find this, it is hard. Usually we're just talking about 2 layers, so it's not as stratified as the stratified squamous. Transitional epithelium we find in the ureters and the bladder. This is going to be hard to identify on this slide because it's called transitional because it changes shape. It is round and flat. So it's round when it's not stretched, and then when that bladder stretches out, the cells have a flat appearance. So for you in the microscope, it may be hard to identify transitional other than looking on what the slide label says. But we see this in our bladder, and this allows for the filling of our urinary tract. That epithelium has to be able to stretch.